In the spring of 1891, a rural parish school in eastern Vermont became the subject of discreet internal inquiry following a series of uncorroborated claims made by several pupils. Teachers noted an unusual pattern. A small group of students independently referenced events, places and terminology unfamiliar to the region or their known family histories. The anomalies were dismissed until one educator attempted to document and verify the children's assertions, triggering involvement from outside educational and clerical officials. What followed was not a search for truth, but a process of quiet containment. The North Harlow Parish School operated under the sponsorship of a regional diocese known for strict curriculum standards and rigorous teacher screening. Promoted as a model for rural education reform, it emphasized moral instruction, structured discipline, and obedience. By 1890, its reputation extended beyond Vermont, attracting visits from state inspectors and clergy. Publicly, it was praised as a beacon of reform. Internally, records suggest an administrative culture focused less on inquiry and more on preservation of image, particularly when unconventional incidents were reported by staff or students. The North Harlow Parish School had been founded in 1878 as a joint initiative between the Vermont Education Board and the Diocesan Committee overseeing rural outreach. The building itself, a two-story wooden structure with a modest bell tower, sat on the edge of a disused mill road. It served approximately 70 children drawn from scattered farms and outlying settlements, many of whom walked several miles each day. Its staff consisted of 3 instructors, 1 rotating curate, and a matron who oversaw midday meals and domestic maintenance. From its inception, North Harlow was positioned as a prototype. Its isolation was viewed as an asset, allowing for uninterrupted implementation of a regimented curriculum combining religious instruction with agricultural labor. Reports submitted to the Education Board consistently referenced its remarkable uniformity in discipline and retention, a phrase that appeared verbatim in annual evaluations for over a decade. Teachers were required to submit weekly progress summaries using pre-approved language, and all correspondence passed through the regional superintendent's desk before entering official archives. The school's founding administrator, Elbridge T. Morsley, held a background in clerical training rather than pedagogy. His appointment had been facilitated by his uncle, a high-ranking cleric within the regional diocese. Morsley's approach centered on what he termed rote character building, a phrase he used to describe the elimination of improvisational behavior in favor of patterned learning. Students recited prayers, arithmetic tables, and moral instructions by repetition, often for extended periods. Reading materials were restricted to sanctioned religious texts, elementary readers, and agricultural almanacs. The teacher most frequently mentioned in internal reports from 1891 was Miss Eleanora C. Dane, a former seminarian's daughter from Rutland County. At 32, she had already taught in 4 separate parochial institutions. Colleagues described her as structured but receptive to observation. She was known to submit more detailed logs than her peers, often including incidental remarks about student temperament or unexpected behavior. Her style was considered overly meticulous by Morsley, who warned her on at least 2 occasions about the inclusion of non-essential reflection. Her habit of documentation, however, became central in identifying a shift in classroom behavior that emerged during the winter term of that year. According to a journal she kept privately, distinct from her official reports, the first sign occurred on January 9th during a routine dictation exercise. A 9-year-old student named Hale, who had consistently struggled with composition, submitted a paragraph describing a coastal watchtower, referencing unfamiliar terms like lighthouse steward and weather drums. Dane initially suspected plagiarism from some rural almanac, though no such content could be found in the school's limited library. Within 2 weeks, 4 additional students produced essays or spoken remarks that referenced maritime environments, despite no direct instruction or prior conversation about seafaring life. The children came from different families and varied in age. Their remarks appeared uncoordinated. One child mentioned repairing rope near a dock. Another recited a series of place names which, when later checked by Dane, corresponded with a district in Essex County, Massachusetts, nearly 100 miles away. The most detailed account came from a student named Ruthie B., age 11, who wrote in her weekly reflection assignment about checking the wharf for tar patches before the overseer returns. The language did not match her typical writing style, and she misspelled several basic words, while correctly using terms unfamiliar to the region. Dane underlined the passage in red ink, but refrained from disciplinary action. Concerned about a possible external influence, Dane inquired about new reading materials or visitors who might have introduced foreign vocabulary. Neither the matron nor the curate recalled any recent changes. School supply shipments had not occurred since November, and all printed materials remained accounted for. When Dane raised the subject briefly with Maudsley, he dismissed the matter as linguistic mimicry and advised her to focus on penmanship standards. By late February, the behavior had become harder to disregard. During oral exercises, several students hesitated before reciting assigned lines, interjecting unrelated phrases that Dane recorded phonetically. In one incident, a pupil answered a simple question about livestock yields with a detailed description of a fog signal station. Dane noted in her private journal that the student appeared surprised at his own words. She began compiling comparative lists, recording each instance where a child used terms or made references inconsistent with their upbringing. The resulting notes showed minimal overlap, suggesting the remarks were not shared or rehearsed among the students. Despite this, each account featured a sense of placement, as though the child had inserted themselves into a past role or occupation. Dane avoided drawing conclusions, but her entries became increasingly methodical, organized by date, student name, and subject matter. When she attempted to discuss the matter further with Maudsley in March, she was instructed to cease all private note-taking and submit only standardized reports. He later added a memo to her personnel file citing excessive tangents in instructional reflection. Following this, Dane began concealing her documentation, writing late at night and storing the pages beneath a false panel in her desk drawer. At the same time, Maudsley issued a new policy directive. All student essays and creative exercises were to follow pre-approved prompts drawn from diocesan publications. Independent composition was temporarily suspended. Lessons shifted further toward rote memorization, with scripture dictation occupying an expanded portion of the daily schedule. The changes were justified in correspondence to the Education Board as discipline fortification during seasonal fatigue. The affected children were not formally identified. No public record indicates parental notification. However, one of Dane's private entries notes that a boy named Emmett H., and who had previously written about measuring tide pool with hanging lead, was reassigned to grounds maintenance duty for several weeks and removed from literacy instruction. Another student, Ruthie B., was said to have fallen ill and did not return that term. Her absence was marked in the attendance register, but left unexplained in official logs. By April, the phenomenon appeared to subside. Dane continued collecting her notes, though the frequency of irregular statements declined. She speculated that the enforced structure might have suppressed further incidents, though she also acknowledged the possibility of self-censorship among the students. Her final entry regarding the matter, dated April 28th, simply read, "No new content observed this week. Students quiet. Normal routine resumed." 2 months later, Dane tendered her resignation, citing family obligations. Her departure was noted without commentary in the summer term register. Her successor, a young instructor from Montpellier, submitted only standardized reports and made no reference to unusual student behavior. No formal investigation was ever conducted. The archived files for the 1891 term contain only Maudsley's official evaluations and student attendance summaries. Dane's private notes were never submitted to diocesan or state authorities. Following Dane's resignation, the atmosphere at North Harlow Parish School became markedly procedural. The new instructor, Edwin L. Carr, was 24 and newly certified by the Diocesan Teaching Board. He relocated from Montpellier with no prior experience in multi-age classroom environments. His appointment was expedited through internal recommendation, and he arrived with instructions to preserve existing methods without deviation. Carr's early correspondence to the district supervisor emphasized routine adherence. He made no alterations to the syllabus and refrained from implementing any personal annotations in his instructional records. The only departure from prior policy was a gradual decrease in creative writing assignments, justified in his reports as a means of improving reading comprehension through repetition. Carr's quarterly summaries described the student body as quiet, cooperative, and focused, using phrasing nearly identical to previous years. Though the teaching staff turned over frequently at rural institutions, the departure of Dane marked a turning point in administrative tone. Morsley's memos became shorter, focused almost exclusively on timeliness, obedience, and protocol. The school year proceeded without formal complaint, and the term closed with full compliance certification from the diocese's annual inspector. No external observers were informed of the prior term's irregularities. However, fragments of Dane's hidden documentation resurfaced through an unrelated audit conducted in October 1891. The audit, intended to assess fire preparedness among remote parish schools, required a full inventory of physical infrastructure. During this process, a state clerk named Orville Meacham examined classroom storage and noted an undocumented cavity beneath the primary desk. The space contained several loose pages, handwritten and undated, detailing the peculiar student responses observed earlier that year. Meacham's report, submitted to the district superintendent, described the writings as curious but unactionable. He did not attach the pages, but summarized them as containing imaginative statements and speculative charts. The documents were sealed and transferred to the Regional Archive Office in Brattleboro without public mention. Their existence was acknowledged in one line of the audit's conclusion, noting non-curricular material of uncertain origin discovered during inventory. No inquiry followed. The documents were never entered into educational records. Their current location is unverified. Despite the absence of official investigation, minor inconsistencies appeared in diocesan correspondence over the next 18 months. In particular, 3 families living on the outskirts of North Harlow submitted informal requests for exemption from compulsory attendance. Their letters, preserved in microfilm, cited indistinct reasons such as environmental strain and developmental divergence. While exemptions were occasionally granted in cases of physical labor needs or health concerns, these petitions included vague language regarding influence by proximity and recitations that are not taught. One letter, signed by the father of 2 enrolled children, referenced a pattern of rehearsal that seems neither instructed nor imagined. The request was declined, but the correspondence was flagged in a marginal note by a clerical reviewer with the phrase, "needs re-inspection next term." No such re-inspection was documented. Among the families that remained compliant, a shift in household behavior was observed by the matron, Mrs. Lydia Fall. In private notes passed to a former colleague in Montpellier, she wrote that certain children now speak less at home than before, and that evening recollections do not match the day's instruction. Her notes are not part of any formal report, and were later donated by her grandson to a local historical society, where they remain uncatalogued. By 1892, staff turnover at the school accelerated. Carr departed in June with no listed destination. His replacement, an instructor named Hiram Wells, remained only 1 term before requesting reassignment due to isolation hardship. Wells left no instructional logs apart from attendance registers. The following winter, Morsley submitted a request to scale back enrollment to a single-room model due to declining numbers. The school was permitted to reduce its intake, though official statements cited weather inconsistencies and harvest fluctuations. Student numbers fell from 70 to 34 within 1 academic year. No district-wide demographic shift can account for this decline. Census data from that period shows stable birth rates and population retention in the surrounding areas. Through 1893 and 1894, the school functioned with 2 instructors and a visiting cleric. Lesson plans focused exclusively on agricultural technique, psalm memorization, and arithmetic. All creative subjects were eliminated. The bell tower was decommissioned following a repair cost assessment. Assembly gatherings were suspended indefinitely. An internal memorandum from that period, suggested consolidating North Harlow with a neighboring parish school located 14 miles south. The proposal was ultimately shelved due to distance complications. Still, diocesan records from 1895 reflect diminishing investment in the facility, with supply shipments halved and teacher salaries frozen despite inflation adjustments. In 1896, the diocesan superintendent made a final site visit. His notes, now stored in the State Education Bureau, mention well-maintained physical space, low disciplinary incidents, and fixed instructional conformity. However, he also added a marginal notation in pencil. Several pupils exhibit monotonic speech patterns, unclear origin. This remark did not appear in the finalized report submitted to the state. The school remained operational until 1901. Its closure was attributed to resource consolidation and changes in regional school zoning. The building was sold to a private tenant and converted into a grain storage facility. No alumni registry or student archive was preserved. The grounds were cleared in 1913 after a structural collapse during a storm. Years later, in 1938, a graduate student researching educational reform in postbellum Vermont discovered a listing for North Harlow Parish School in a defunct diocesan yearbook. Her interest stemmed from the school's absence in later directories, despite its early recognition as a model institution. She located only one surviving reference in the Brattleboro Regional Archive, where an unlabeled box contained Meacham's original fire audit paperwork. Inside the folder was a typed memorandum summarizing the discovery of unusual student writings, along with a stamped directive indicating the contents had been archived under supplemental review, not for distribution. The original pages by Eleanora Dane were not included. A brief note in red ink, presumably added decades later, read, "Material possibly refiled or withdrawn. No additional documents have been found. No former students were ever identified for interview. Parish officials who had served during the period had all either retired or passed without leaving memoirs." By the late 20th century, North Harlow Parish School had become a footnote in historical indexes, often misattributed or conflated with similarly named institutions. The events recorded by Dane remained undocumented in formal educational history. Her writings, if they still exist, were never published or acknowledged outside archival citation. The pattern of reduced documentation following the 1891 school term left few formal indicators of irregularity. However, scattered notations in unrelated parish, civic, and diocesan records suggest a parallel sequence of low-level alerts that were never integrated into any single review. These fragments, often handwritten or embedded within broader assessments, form the only traceable indicators that further concerns persisted outside the school itself. In the summer of 1892, a field census conducted by the Vermont Board of Agriculture recorded an unexplained spike in absenteeism among school-age children in the northern township of Bracken Hill, located just 8 miles east of North Harlow. The report lists 17 children registered as absent from seasonal instruction, a figure twice the typical count for that region. When interviewed, local families cited vague references to behavioral realignment and need for recalibration at home. The census clerk marked the entries with a / rather than a formal code, indicating uncertainty about how to categorize the responses. None of the affected households reported illness, relocation, or employment necessity, which were the 3 sanctioned exemptions for school absence. One family submitted a statement noting their child's unusual orientation in speech and memory, phrasing not found elsewhere in the census records. The clerk underlined the sentence but did not pursue clarification. No follow-up correspondence was filed. Later that same year, a traveling diocesan reader named Julian C. Moran, employed to assess scripture retention at remote parish schools, submitted a restricted memorandum following a site visit to a neighboring institution in South Traver. His letter, addressed to the diocesan vice secretary, mentioned encountering students who paused before recitation as though uncertain whose words they were speaking. Moran did not name the school or its instructors, but he emphasized that the issue seemed to be non-defiant, consistent, and regionally concentrated. The note was filed as part of his travel reimbursement log and was not attached to any performance report. In March 1893, a teaching assistant newly assigned to the North Harlow region withdrew from her post after one term, citing instructional misalignment. Her departure form, archived in the State Educator Register, includes a handwritten addendum in the margin. Children's responses reflect experience they do not possess. The addendum was unsigned and does not appear in any supporting documents. Her personnel file remained incomplete. A second assistant, hired that autumn to replace her, remained in the position for 2 months before submitting a written request to be transferred to an urban post with clearer boundaries between instruction and interpretation. His letter, addressed to the central office in Burlington, described an environment in which students possess detail that exceeds their assigned curriculum, yet do not acknowledge deviation. No formal action was taken, and the assistant's transfer was approved without further inquiry. The Diocesan Education Log from 1894 lists a routine equipment audit of 6 parish schools, including North Harlow. The summary concludes all schools were compliant with state requisites. However, a page inserted between the report's final 2 sheets contains a typewritten list of unspecified, verbatim repetitions traced to unknown source. The page lacks signature or letterhead and includes no indication of who compiled the entries. The phrases listed appear to correspond with nautical and industrial terminology not typically associated with elementary curriculum. One example reads, "Coil the tar line flat to dry, else the gauge won't read." The purpose of the list is not explained, and the page is stored loosely among otherwise sequential documents. By the winter of 1895, these disparate observations had not converged into any formal review. Instead, they remained isolated within their respective departments, filed under transportation, curriculum compliance, census tracking, or employment rotation. At no point did any governing body initiate a consolidated examination of the affected region. The geographic proximity of these notations to North Harlow went unacknowledged in state documentation. Outside institutional channels, the only known personal account from that period comes from a traveling penmanship instructor, Mrs. Isoline W. Korn, whose private diary was later acquired by the Rutland County Historical Society. Korn visited over 24 parish schools in Vermont between 1892 and 1896, offering short-term instruction in lettering and formal script. Her entry dated May 19, 1894, recounts a visit to a rural school she identifies only as H location, presumed by archivists to be North Harlow. In her description, Korn notes a peculiar pattern in student posture and articulation. She wrote, "They write steadily, yet hesitate when speaking aloud, as if checking something before each word." Her diary includes no conclusion, but the entry was marked with a small red ink circle, a notation she used rarely. Korn's notes were not published during her lifetime and were only discovered in 1972 during a broader collection effort. Her route maps confirm she was in Windsor County that week, placing her in feasible proximity to North Harlow. While this alone does not confirm the identity of the school, no other institution beginning with the letter H existed in that immediate region at the time. Later that year, during a scheduled inspection tour, a supervisor from the Brattleboro district submitted a form labeled Verbal Conduct Irregularity, Minor. The form was part of a newly introduced protocol intended to allow inspectors to report soft behavioral concerns without triggering disciplinary review. The inspector, identified as Walter M. Griggs, checked only one box on the form: recitation anomaly. No description was provided, and the section for further detail was left blank. The document was placed in the school's folder and not cross-referenced with any other site. In 1896, the Regional Archive noted the withdrawal of 5 children from parish schools within a 15-mile radius of North Harlow. The records include withdrawal reasons marked only as parental prerogative. Inquiries into the homes produced no interviews or additional statements. However, 2 of the households subsequently registered with the state's experimental home instruction program, which had been launched that year as a pilot project. In their applications, both families noted an intention to reorient foundational perspective in their children's instruction, a phrase that appears in no other application for that program. One final document, filed in a clerical training manual used by new rural educators, includes an untitled marginal note in handwriting distinct from the main text. It reads, "If children remember wrongly, they must have heard rightly. Do not chase the cause, enforce the pattern." The note has no signature or date. The page it appears on addresses student discipline in multi-grade classrooms. It is unclear when the note was added or by whom. By the close of the 1890s, references to student memory irregularities ceased entirely in formal state education records. Parish correspondence grew shorter, focused exclusively on supply orders, teacher turnover, and seasonal building conditions. Observations of student behavior became confined to attendance and hygiene. Across official documentation, the term recitation reverted to its standard usage, no longer accompanied by modifiers or qualifying remarks. In 1897, the State Committee on Rural Instruction published its biennial review. Within its 118 pages, only a single reference appeared regarding the North Harlow district. It cited a declining enrollment rate and recommended consideration for eventual absorption into the neighboring East Corvin School Division. The accompanying footnote mentioned limited curricular diversity and repetitive instructional structure. The review, assembled largely from submitted logs and attendance data, included no first-hand observations. One of the reviewers, a junior clerk named Simon Perrott, later recalled in a 1921 interview with the Vermont Historical Journal that he had flagged the North Harlow entry due to what he called passive uniformity in the student results. Perrott was never assigned to visit the site, but he had been responsible for charting vocabulary retention scores across 8 rural schools. North Harlow's data showed what he termed repetitive recurrence, where student responses matched identically across unrelated subjects. He described it as memorized without comprehension. His note was disregarded in the final draft, as the editorial committee considered the matter one of curriculum redundancy rather than behavioral insight. That same year, a minor procedural dispute unfolded during the annual diocesan personnel audit. A candidate for reassignment, Mrs. Elvador, had listed prior experience at North Harlow Parish School on her application. When questioned about her term of service, she provided dates inconsistent with diocesan payroll records. Her official file showed no record of assignment. In a handwritten reply to the personnel office, Dorr insisted she had taught at North Harlow for 7 weeks as temporary substitute during late spring term. No formal substitute appointment had been processed. To resolve the discrepancy, an internal cleric assigned to the Education Board, Father Merrill Roan, conducted a review of the 1895 payroll ledger. He confirmed that no wages had been distributed under Dorr's name. However, in the margins of that year's term ledger, the initials ED appeared twice beside standard entries for lesson completion. Roan added a private note to her file stating, "Service informally rendered, corroboration unclear." Dorr's reassignment was postponed indefinitely. She never held another teaching post in the diocesan system. The following winter, during preparations for the 1898 legislative session, a small working group of policy advisors examined inconsistencies in the use of supplemental materials at select rural schools. Among the flagged institutions was North Harlow, where auditors had noted repeated submission of identical writing samples across multiple terms. A footnote in the draft report described the material as recycled reflections, unaltered in syntax or content. The group recommended further inquiry into the source of these writings. Before the inquiry could begin, the building that housed the Diocesan Archive Division suffered structural damage during an early thaw. Dozens of boxes, including the education supplement files, were temporarily relocated and subsequently refiled without inventory tags. When the policy group reconvened in March, no documentation regarding North Harlow could be located. The proposed review was dropped from the agenda. Over the next 3 years, several infrastructural updates occurred in the surrounding districts. Schools with larger enrollments received new wood-burning stoves and updated slates. By contrast, North Harlow received no additional supplies. State records from 1899 list the school as inactive but not closed, a designation reserved for institutions awaiting consolidation. Despite this, a teaching assignment was still posted to the diocesan hiring board each spring. The final teacher listed for the institution was Miss Eloise Garrity, aged 23, appointed in early 1900. Her personnel file is one of the shortest in the diocesan archive. It contains a signed contract, 2 receipts for transport reimbursement, and a single end-of-term statement. That statement consists of 7 words. Lessons delivered in full, attendance unverified, Garrity. No inspection logs from that year mention her post. Her name does not appear in the standard teacher-to-parent correspondence roster maintained by the district clerk. Her departure is undated and no letter of resignation was filed. By 1901, the building was no longer used for instruction. Its decommissioning was noted in an annual property review conducted by the State Office of Facilities. A photograph taken during the assessment shows a shuttered structure with missing roof shingles and a partially collapsed bell tower. The accompanying caption reads, "Formerly North Harlow Parish School. Inactive since spring term, year uncertain." That same year, a local land registry office in Bracken Hill processed a transfer of property ownership from the diocesan holdings to a private citizen named Ferris Layton. Layton was a merchant who had recently acquired several rural properties for use as grain depots. The deed lists the building as former instructional facility, abandoned condition, east wing compromised. Layton made no structural improvements. Within a decade, the roof had failed completely, and the walls were reinforced only to the extent needed to store feed. During a 1912 survey of obsolete educational properties conducted as part of a regional preservation project, an architectural inspector named Harold Rill documented the remains of the North Harlow site. His notes, now stored in the Vermont State Library, reference indications of unusual classroom segmentation. He describes partial partitioning inside the main chamber that did not match the floor plans of standard 2-room schoolhouses. Rill marked several notches carved into desk frames and a pattern of overlapping initials scored repeatedly into the back of a supply cabinet. He did not attempt to interpret their origin. Among the inspector's photographs is a close-up of a ledger fragment found beneath a collapsed shelf. The fragment contains what appears to be a student roster, though the names are faint and partially obscured by water damage. One line is legible. Ruthie B. Placement undetermined. The sheet is undated, and its presence in the building contradicts earlier claims that no records had been stored on site. No additional documents were recovered during the inspection. The building was scheduled for demolition in 1913 due to structural hazard. Layton authorized the dismantling and retained salvageable wood for resale. The remaining material was burned as refuse. No public notice was issued. In the years that followed, North Harlow was mentioned only once in state correspondence, in a 1924 Facilities Index listing decommissioned properties. It was assigned Code 3706, with the annotation, "Unsuitable for reinstatement, site reclaimed." By that time, the location had returned to underbrush. No signage or boundary markers remained. The site's coordinates were recorded only in property records, which by 1930 had been folded into a broader zoning map under the Bracken Hill district. No one revisited the matter until the late 1950s, when a graduate thesis on rural educational disappearance included a passing reference to the institution. The student, Arlen D. Feather, wrote a single paragraph noting the school's unusually high turnover and lack of terminal records. His advisor instructed him to remove the paragraph before submission, stating the material was insufficiently verified. The redacted section, preserved in a research folder, includes only one marked question: where did they go? In 1968, during the early phase of a university-sponsored archival project aimed at digitizing neglected rural school records, a junior assistant at the Vermont State Library named Keir Roughton encountered an uncategorized envelope stored behind a mislabeled geography drawer. The envelope contained 6 pages of handwritten notes in red ink, an unbound attendance register from 1891, and a receipt for inkstone delivery addressed to a Miss Eleanora Dane. The materials had not been referenced in any catalogue or preservation inventory. Roughton flagged the documents due to the inconsistency of the penmanship and the recurrence of maritime terms embedded within otherwise standard lesson entries. His report to the archive coordinator noted a collision of referential planes, a phrase drawn from classification guidelines used to indicate content outside intended topical boundaries. The note was acknowledged, and the materials were sent for temporary review. Within weeks, they were placed under restricted access pending verification. That same year, a seminar on regional education reform, hosted at Bennington College, invited scholars to submit inquiries into abandoned rural institutions. Among the attendees was Dr. Renata Elwell, a historian specializing in the intersection of pedagogical policy and ecclesiastical governance. She had previously conducted a study on disciplinary thresholds in postbellum New England boarding schools. During a break session, Rowton introduced the contents of the envelope, describing the fragments without interpretation. Intrigued, Elwell requested temporary access and later received a partial transcript. Her response, preserved in university correspondence, included the phrase, "layered memory misattributed to instructor or improperly trained record keeper." She later revised her assessment, writing, "The syntax is child-derived but lacks invention. Vocabulary and reference structures suggest prior function not yet understood." Her interest prompted an informal request to review diocesan personnel records, which were then stored in a secondary archive located at a parish facility in Randolph. The records from Randolph, though incomplete, included a personnel memo from 1892 listing instructors who had received formal warnings for deviation from documentation protocol. Among the names was Eleanora C. Dane, cited for introspective additions and speculative classification. The memo had never been included in official teaching assessments submitted to the state. Elwell photographed the entry and cross-referenced it against the inkstone receipt found in Rowton's envelope. The handwriting matched. This connection initiated a limited inquiry funded through Elwell's department, titled "Structural Recitation and Anomalous Memory in Rural Learning Systems." While framed academically, the focus narrowed quickly to identifying linguistic and behavioral patterns in the surviving fragments. A research assistant, Nora Vaughn, was assigned to sort language samples from the Dane materials and compare them with contemporary schoolhouse writing exercises from the same period. The results of Vaughn's comparison, compiled over 6 months, showed that a significant number of phrases from the North Harlow materials had no parallel in other school records. More notably, the phrases did not reflect typical childlike deviation. Instead, they exhibited specific procedural language associated with manual operations. Examples included sequences such as "check for hinge slack before coil secures" and "rotate by drop marks, not by weight." These did not align with any instructional material known to be used in Vermont parochial schools during the 1890s. Further complicating the analysis was the internal consistency of the language. While disjointed in subject, the phrases maintained precise grammar and repeated specific verb structures. Elwell hypothesized that the content might reflect occupational memory traces, though she stopped short of suggesting causation. Her internal memo to the research team posed the question, could children cite process from familiarity without source access? Seeking external evaluation, the team contacted a retired maritime safety engineer named Edwin Sutcliffe, who had spent 3 decades cataloging procedural handbooks from 19th century coastal facilities. After reviewing select transcripts, Sutcliffe responded with a note that read, "These aren't instructional, they're operational. Not how to do something, but what was done routinely." He later clarified that the language bore resemblance to logbook shorthand used in fog signal stations along the Massachusetts coastline between 1860 and 1885. This assessment introduced the first specific temporal and geographic reference point tied to the anomalous language. The team expanded its research to include known rosters from maritime facilities in the Essex County area. However, no direct match was found between recorded personnel and any known student or family associated with North Harlow. The absence of overlap limited conclusions, though Elwell remarked privately that discontinuity may itself be procedural. At the same time, a separate line of investigation was initiated into the diocesan supply chain, prompted by a discrepancy in documented delivery routes. A series of 1891 invoices showed that ink and binding materials had been shipped to North Harlow using an unusually indirect routing code, typically reserved for storage sites rather than active institutions. One invoice contained a carrier's annotation reading, "Not marked for pupil access." This suggested that at least some of the shipped materials may have been intended for internal or administrative use only. In January 1970, Elwell presented preliminary findings at a closed seminar hosted by the Northeast Educational Archive Association. Her presentation, titled "Echoed Instruction and Referential Drift in Isolated Systems," outlined a theory that instructional environments could reproduce operational language patterns under conditions of repetition and containment. She avoided attributing origin or assigning motive. The session drew minimal attention, and her findings were never submitted for peer review. Following the seminar, Elwell declined further involvement in the project. Her resignation letter from the inquiry team cited a need to return to more verifiable instructional histories. She left behind annotated documents, marginalia, and a brief closing remark addressed to Varn. "Keep tracking the overlap. It's not about the why, it's about the when." Varn assumed informal custodianship of the remaining materials, storing them in her private collection until 1984, when they were donated to the Special Collections Division of the University of Vermont under sealed agreement. Access was restricted to researchers with background in educational history or linguistic classification. The contents were entered into a digital index labeled "Repetitive Structures, Unaligned Data Origin." The index entry includes 63 line items, each representing a unique phrase or notation extracted from the original Dane documents. Of these, 41 include annotations noting "no curricular precedent." Cross-referencing continued for another decade with limited advancement. As of 1996, only 4 phrases had been partially matched to known historical records, 2 associated with 1870s textile mill shift logs from New Hampshire, 1 appearing in an 1881 repair protocol for a grain pulley system in Maine, and 1 found in an 1875 incident ledger from a Cape Ann fog station. Each reference shared a consistent pattern, not instructional in nature, but procedural. The language did not suggest learning, but repetition of routine within systems now obsolete. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. The limited overlaps between the extracted language and known procedural records prompted a re-evaluation of initial classification assumptions. By 1998, a subcommittee within the university's archival linguistics group compiled a working model titled "Extracted Operational Recall Without Source Anchoring." The document, distributed internally, proposed that recurring language patterns from the North Harlow fragments did not originate in instruction, but emerge through imitation of routine from an unknown external structure. The term used was echo-proceduralism. The committee outlined 3 attributes specific to the entries: consistent use of past tense imperative, omission of reference subject, and exact repetition of non-instructional sequences across unrelated students. One example, noted in 3 student logs from separate months, read, "Pull drum till bracket sticks, then fix it cold." The terminology was evaluated against all known mechanical and agricultural references in Vermont's 1890s instructional manuals. No match was found. Attempts to trace possible environmental or migratory influences on the region failed to yield direct connections. Shipyard employment was rare in inland Vermont, and census reviews for Windsor County between 1880 and 1895 did not show significant movement from coastal Massachusetts. Interviews conducted in the early 2000s with descendants of known North Harlow families produced minimal anecdotal information. One descendant recalled that her grandfather had spoken short phrases without knowing why, but the context and dates could not be confirmed. Attention then shifted to the original ink used in the student writings. A material analysis performed in 2003 at the Northeast Paper Laboratory concluded that the red ink present in Dane's notes and student annotations had higher ferric concentration than typical school-grade stock. The ink composition matched variants used in administrative logs and technical correspondence, not elementary education. While not conclusive, the results supported the idea that at least some materials used at North Harlow were non-standard in origin. Among the remaining fragments was a partially torn lesson sheet containing staggered lines of dictation. While the majority matched standard prayer book extracts, several lines diverged. One line positioned midway through the page read, "Tied up before shift ends, or it pulls." The phrase lacked context and was not aligned with surrounding content. It had been underlined faintly in pencil and marked with the initials EC, assumed to be Eleanora C. Dane. That sheet became the focal point of renewed analysis in 2006, when linguistic patterning software was applied to the entire North Harlow corpus. Of the 312 unique phrases documented from the archive, 15 appeared more than once. All 15 shared structural similarity with operational directives from disused occupations, maritime logistics, textile mill routines, and early signal operations. Yet no phrase was complete enough to indicate task origin. Each stood as a partial unit, suggestive, but never clarifying. Dr. Edwin Colsey, a visiting analyst from the Institute for Language and Systems, published a paper the following year in which he posited a hypothesis he called residual syntax without carrier. According to Colsey, the North Harlow materials demonstrated the persistence of functional grammar detached from both instruction and experience. In his view, the language fragments were not learned, not observed, but retained outside context. He proposed that some institutional structures, when repeated across multiple agents, could imprint functional patterns into isolated environments without direct contact. This proposal was met with cautious interest, but little endorsement. Most reviewers found the concept theoretically sound but unprovable under existing constraints. The university declined to fund further research into the model, and Colsey returned to England without publishing a follow-up. By 2010, institutional interest in the North Harlow fragments had waned. The materials remained sealed under controlled access, referenced only occasionally by researchers working on pattern theory or educational containment structures. The index was maintained, but no new items were added. The cataloging software was updated to reflect archival naming standards, and the digital references were assigned the classification code SP1891NH, Extracted Routines, Ambiguous Provenance. That same year, a doctoral candidate in procedural history named Lara Ibbott submitted a thesis proposal to recontextualize the North Harlow materials through the lens of containment pedagogy. Her angle was administrative rather than linguistic. Ibbott's interest centered on how institutions respond when instruction does not produce its intended effect. She argued that the school's administrative silence, increased standardization, and teacher reassignments formed a closed response system that prioritized structural persistence over instructional resolution. In her submitted chapter draft, Ibbott wrote, "When language emerges that does not align with curricular frameworks, institutions tend not to question its content, but instead suppress its occurrence. The method of removal becomes the policy." She cited the replacement of Dane, the redirection of creative assignments, and the decline in enrollment as reactive mechanisms rather than active solutions. Ibbott's thesis was accepted, but her final manuscript included no transcriptions from the original fragments. Permissions had not been granted for reproduction, and she opted not to include even paraphrased examples. Instead, she appended a 2-page summary of institutional response cycles based on known administrative behaviors documented from similar parochial schools. North Harlow was mentioned only in the abstract, labeled as a unique instance of eco-pedagogy containment. Despite its limited scope, the thesis reintroduced the case into archival discourse. In 2012, the university's Special Collections Division commissioned a conservation review of the remaining documents. The report, finalized in 2014, concluded that deterioration was minimal but recommended limited handling. As part of the review, each page was digitally scanned and stored under encrypted reference code. Access was restricted to institutional researchers with clearance and purpose-specific credentialing. The only known public presentation of the materials occurred in 2016 during a closed seminar at the Institute for Archival Systems. Dr. Harlan Motta, an administrator with prior experience in data repetition analysis, presented a session titled Function Without Presence: The Structural Remnants of Echo Instruction. His presentation, which included select phrase examples, described the North Harlow case as a known structure manifesting without direct source input. He emphasized that the value lay not in the phrases themselves, but in the pattern of administrative avoidance they provoked. In his closing remarks, Motta stated, "We have not found the origin. We likely never will. But what remains is not random. The structure of the memory is consistent. The students cited a system. The system did not teach them. And the institution, rather than investigate, removed the record of deviation and continued forward as if instruction had succeeded." Following this, the North Harlow materials were cited in one further internal paper, then retired from active inquiry. The grounds where North Harlow Parish School once stood have long since reverted to woodland, with no surface structure or historical marker identifying the location. A gravel logging road passes within 40 yards of the former site, though it diverges into privately leased land before reaching the area indicated in archival land transfer documents. The absence of signage or commemoration reflects not an oversight, but a sequence of decisions made through procedural neglect and disinterest. The institution, once cited as a model of remote instruction, was allowed to disappear without acknowledgement. In 2017, a joint initiative between the Vermont Survey of Educational Foundations and the Historical Topography Commission undertook a project to map vanished instructional properties across the state. North Harlow was listed as code VME 0479, with an annotation indicating no structural remains, no market boundary. Its coordinates were estimated using deed logs, 1890s property taxes, and an 1886 civil planning survey, which marked the property as elevated clear field, west incline, moderate slope. No existing property owner petitioned to preserve or restrict access to the estimated area. During the mapping phase, surveyor Dana Mickelson recorded a flat depression measuring approximately 40 feet in width, covered in layered moss and intermittent growth. Shallow indentations were noted, consistent with prior structural pilings. Mickelson made no comment on the site's history and submitted only standard photos. The documentation was archived under Former Instructional Area, Condition, Inert. No excavation was requested or performed. Parallel to this, the University Archive holding the sealed North Harlow documents transitioned to a digital preservation protocol. The scanned images were encoded into a secure archival database without metadata interpretation. Each page received a numerical identifier, stripped of contextual descriptors, to comply with institutional neutrality policy. The only accessible information included creation medium, page dimensions, and script orientation. The content itself was no longer searchable by language. The decision was formalized in a memo issued by the Special Collections Ethics Committee, which stated, "The retention of structurally anomalous materials without established narrative function necessitates index-based isolation to preserve source integrity and minimize speculative interpretation." The phrase structurally anomalous was left undefined. That same year, a symposium held by the Institute for Memory Frameworks included a short presentation by Dr. Mira Eklund, who referenced the North Harlow fragments without naming the school. Her paper, Unaligned Recall in Closed Instructional Systems, drew from archival studies involving undocumented linguistic formation in controlled environments. Her model suggested that under certain sustained instructional constraints, linguistic elements could emerge from non-curricular echo patterns, shaped not by experience, but by exposure to routine through observation or reinforcement. She posited a framework in which procedural language, once embedded, could surface in future iterations of structured environments without material transmission. Her model was based on theoretical repetition without origin. While the presentation used only anonymized examples, a footnote in the extended abstract referenced A Vermont school, decommissioned pre-1900, index withheld. This marked the final known academic reference to the material in public form. Internally, the university archived an unsigned request in 2018 to cross-reference the North Harlow fragments with the state's oral history repository. The request was declined due to classification incompatibility and lack of documented informants. A notation by the reviewing board indicated insufficient correlational integrity for cross-archive inclusion. Since then, no formal inquiry has been submitted. The site remains unmarked. The original documents have not been cited in any additional academic publication. Requests for public access have ceased. In 2021, the Department of Rural Education Metrics published a report titled Closure Patterns and Silent Decommissions in 19th Century Vermont. The North Harlow entry was one of 114 cases listed without legacy review. The summary included the following language: institutional end date unknown, operational discontinuity noted, no closure hearing, no commemorative record, no alumni tracking. The entry closed with a notation in brackets: curricular consistency documented, retention outcome unclear. The silence surrounding the institution's closure was not imposed externally, but selected internally through a series of choices favoring structural continuity over interpretive inquiry. When the documented outputs failed to match instructional inputs, containment was preferred to clarification. The students were not consulted. Their accounts, whether written or spoken, were never included in district logs or parental letters. No corrective was issued. The anomaly was managed procedurally. This approach extended into subsequent handling. The physical materials, once flagged, were not destroyed or censored. Instead, they were preserved in isolation, disconnected from their referential frame. The documents remain intact, fully legible and accurately dated, yet no longer housed within a narrative system. Their content is accessible only by page number, detached from identity or context. Among the final pages in the archive is a short sentence written in a child's hand, underlined twice in red. I remembered something I didn't forget. The phrase appears without surrounding text, unaligned to any assignment or prompt. It is the only instance in the file that uses the first person. No analysis has been applied to the sentence. No external scholar has cited it in published research. It remains indexed as SP 1891 ton NH page 56, undesignated writing sample. In 2023, a municipal planning initiative for low-impact hiking paths in Windsor County briefly referenced the land tract formerly designated as North Harlow. The site appeared in an internal routing map under the label Undeveloped Sector 12A. Notes from the planning subcommittee described it as cleared grade with minimal vegetation variation. The designation was intended for temporary trail access, though the proposal was withdrawn after a subsequent inspection revealed unstable ground due to historical subgrade collapse. The surveyor's summary included the phrase, structural disturbance, legacy origin unknown. No follow-up was conducted. That same year, a revision of the Vermont Public Records Statute permitted cross-institutional queries for dormant records under re-evaluation status. A graduate researcher in procedural linguistics submitted a batch request seeking fragments containing non-instructional repetition from institutions closed prior to 1900. The query returned 7 partial matches. One entry was redacted, with the descriptor access restricted per protocol S11. Internal review confirmed that this referred to the North Harlow collection. No appeal was filed. The researcher was not notified of the match's significance. The flagged record was returned to a locked queue within the university's digital archive, marked as sealed context-dependent recurrence. In 2024, the Office of Historical Integrity launched a data reconciliation program to align census and education reports across Vermont's pre-1900 records. During this process, a discrepancy was noted involving student enumeration in the Bracken Hill district for the year 1891. According to the census, 37 children were reported as residing in the sector. The North Harlow School Register from the same year, preserved in scanned format, lists 41 names. The 4 additional entries do not correspond with any birth certificate, residence file, or labor registration from the region. They are not listed in the diocesan family visitation logs or in any tax documentation. The names appear in consistent handwriting, in sequence with the others, and are checked off across multiple dates. Their inclusion does not disrupt the visual continuity of the register. They follow the same spacing, ink type, and attendance pattern as verified entries. An inquiry was initiated by the Reconciliation Committee to confirm whether the names might represent transient families or data transfer errors. The committee found no matching records in adjoining counties, no marriage, property, or migration data linked to the names. A notation in the committee's log reads, "Entries appear procedural, not biographical." No further determination was made. The inconsistency was marked as administratively unresolved and excluded from the published reconciliation summary. As of 2025, no further investigation has been proposed. The collection remains intact, its digital access unchanged. None of the names in question have been reassigned or removed. The redacted entry remains labeled as SP 1891-NH Group C, with access restricted to oversight personnel only. The physical documents have not been handled since their last preservation inspection in 2014. No memorial marker has been installed. The State Directory of Decommissioned Schools includes no image or annotation beside the North Harlow entry. A printed map of the region omits the site entirely. No formal resolution exists. What remains are fragments that do not reinforce instruction, but echo function. Language that reappears without prompting, embedded in routine. Written by hands that followed guidance without known source, matched to environments never visited, matched to systems no longer operational. The pages persist without summary, never declared anomalous, only filed under restricted retention. In a sealed folder inside the university archive, 2 final items were added in 2016. The first is a photo of a rotted ledger cover bearing the faint impression of the school's name. The second is a sheet of student writing, lines faint and wavering. It contains only 4 words. I remember the place. There is no notation beneath. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.